So I would contend that one of the great foundations of Marxism as a political and intellectual force has been the power and lucidity of its theory of history. Its tremendous appeal lied not only in explaining the past, but declaring up the roadmap for the future, revealing the triumph of the working class, not just the petty desires of individuals, but an objective historical force. Beyond even that, being a protagonist of the community called salvation, dissolving class society in itself and realizing a classless, stateless, monoless communist society. Like much of Marx's vocabulary, the theory and system of Karl Marx was named by his compatriot, Friedrich Engels. Marx himself called it furthermore so as the Marxist conception of history, or the materialist conception of history, sorry. Well, Engels christened it historic materialism, which is how I'll be referring from here on. I have to briefly illuminate its main foundations and then discuss more on its triumphs, its uses as political and historical force, and also cover those critical flaws that have surfaced through the years. And I sort of have to illuminate and challenge this, look especially at Louis Althusser's Materialism on the Counter, one of his later works and ideas on this topic, and to have to propose a reworked historic materialism that, or this foundational one that can help us still prove social Marxism as a living thing, as somebody said, in the historical discipline certainly, and political as well. So what is historic materialism exactly? It's got a varied thing, but in broad terms, I would characterize it as our three main propositions. That is the primitive class struggle, the modes of production as stages of history, and the base over superstructure. According to Marx, the main driver of social change is competition of socioeconomic classes, which as a result of the economic situation have fundamentally and irreconcilably different interests. The contestation, hence called materialism, as it relates to physical and material things, and not the development and contestation of ideas to define a more idealist interpretation of history. Perhaps most importantly, Marxism in history is progressing through several consecutive stages, which are the modes of production, each mode being centered on a specific configuration of our owners of the resources and the laborers who operate and relate to each other, the relations of production. Mode of production is therefore the union, or the sum, if you want to use a broken mathematical notation, of the means of production, which can be hunting and gathering, agriculture, or indeed industry, and the specific relation to production in sort of a specific configuration or a dual combination, whatever you want to call it. Marx argued there are 6 of these modes. In his past, there would have been the primitive, or occupying most of the world in his time, the primitive, which is hunter-gathering, classical, which means slave in this context, the Asiatic, which I will discuss a bit later, and also the feudal. While Europe itself corresponds to present in capitalist mode of production, and the future still had the promise of the final one, the communist or the socialist. That's kind of another thing. And that's just based in superstructure, I touched very briefly. It's a theory that views society like as a building, which the base, the material reality, and social relations and circumstances is like the base or the foundation of the building. The superstructure, the super being above, not extra, so there's the above structure is influenced and shaped by that foundation. So the customs, laws, and ideologies are hence more dependent on the material reality in the very orthodox, a very sort of canonized view of Marxism, which of course is the same Marxist only view, of course. Of course, as discussed, this already has very potential in it. And as historians like Erwin Claes have pointed out, the greatest thing of Marxism and extension of historic materialism is that it's very flexible, functioning simultaneously as sort of complex theoretical systems that attain like important intelligentsia and study and discuss it, but also it's able to be condensed into vivid slogans for masses. You saw the slides before I try to illustrate how these are from the comments from the Festo and a bit stiff, but still get the point across, I think. For this from the history itself, most reduction offer, I think, much superior periodization compared to the standard formula, which is sort of pre-classical, classical, medieval, early modern, modern, late modern, postmodern, potentially, which are rather arbitrary and also not become anything. All modes of production are based around analysis of its material and social relationships and nature, and hence allow us to sort of critical study and separate them in a weird way. What's first most crucial insight Marx makes is that each mode production enables and restricts certain forms of social organization. And this is during technology. For example, the society that enables a windmill is so different from a technology of atomic power or fossil power. Themselves are different, of course, enables different social organization. And hence, you need a critical view at sort of material view of things. That said, shortcomings has become clear. Yeah, so illustration of history seems to go against historic materialism. A perfect Bob is I canonize Marxism in its sort of orthodox, rigid form. It's very teleological, it assumes and sort of works towards an end of history, the final stage of communism. Sort of illusion as sort of viewed as a quite difficult hold since the sort of downturn of the late national labor movement and struggles in the 70s and 80s until the present. There's sort of a catastrophe of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 being sort of the most symbolic of that. I mean, the inevitable victory of proletariat seemed far more distant now than it did only a few decades ago. The further stage of system also found itself very complicated, as discussion previously made clear, it is very Eurocentric, in that it's often merely the prescriptive phases of classical European history. In my mind, so it starts with similar as sort of classical, sort of all the volumes of history you find, often like old libraries and things. So it's civilization starts with Mesopotamia and things and moves to classical Greece and Rome and then Latin Europe. And then depending on the edition, so case in point, sort of civilization of Aaron Durant pictured here doesn't really do that. But it's sort of often have like a volume of two other things later on about incredibly things happen elsewhere as well, of some consequence, sadly. And this, of course, which again is a sort of deep political problem, also a practical issue, and the validity of historic materialism as a concept. Such bit on the sort of most egregious offender being a setting of production being sort of case in point on this, being sort of schizophrenic, for the term. Marx originally referred to it as the absence of private property. Example in his correspondent Engels, 1853, where it's asked for a property, all property is owned by the state, the oriental despot, and sort of controlled as hydraulic measure of water control and irrigation, things like the Nile or Tigris or in China, for example. While later on in the Grundrisse, it thinks it's more of Yasali mode is more the surviving sort of communal and kinship structures, local level, being their own property there, and there's always superimposed sort of state level on top of that. And they sort of go back and forth with works as well. We're trying to synthesize like so different. And the problem clearly is that there are synthesize different historical circumstances and contexts in like a unified system, which doesn't seem to make coherent and thus to be actually useful and helpful. Of course, this problem is not anything specifically new or clear. They have been for a long time, people have discussed for a long time, though often they seem to evolve around sort of petty circumstances and disputes. For example, what is feudalism exactly? How widespread is it? Was the Mughal Empire in India feudal? Was China feudal? Are they Asiatic? And these are sort of interesting in a way, but also not helpful to really solve sort of deeper problems we found in Marxism, in sort of the official Marxism. I want to emphasize though that these problems I find are largely ancestral, as they are sort of results of influences Marx, all the kinds of father Marx pulled from. As Lenin's old maxim goes, Marxism is a synthesis of French radicalism, German idealism, and British political economy. And it was a simplistic explanation, but it does get across that much of inspiration comes from sort of Enlightenment ideas, which all part are very theological, very optimistic, looking at social economic developments around them, few exceptions. And so a stage system of mass production is in large part lifted from sort of Scottish Enlightenment ideals of the conjunctural history. It sees history as perhaps more systematic done by Adam Smith in his works, where it's human society goes through 4 stages of hunting, gathering, pasturage, agriculture, and then commerce. We can see as a clear link there to modes of production. Even though, of course, Marx's ideas are material, while the sort of Scottish Enlightenment view of them were like separated by laws and for moral views they enable. So, of course, that's something that's not exclusive to Marxism by any means. Ancestral problems was found in contemporary liberalism, where it also very logical, so assuming modern capitalism as the end stage was what its horrible form of it, while also having, so it's also having a sort of semi-stable theory that's not properly formalized, but still exists in its notions of developed and undeveloped countries, democracies and dictatorships, which sort of can hope to reach the final stage of like economically advanced liberal society. So rather, what I think we need, or Marxism generally is trying to promote, is what try to go deeper into the cracks, into all this, and try to resolve the deeper institutes of Marxism, which are read this more fundamentally. I think one approach that did do this, and it's not alone, is the work from Louis Althusser on this, his later works on materialism of the encounter, or the underground current, as he dubs it, also known as aleatory materialism, which he calls materialism of the rain, the swerve, and the encounter. And so it traces, and he kind of sees this as an underground tradition of Western philosophy, which it traces throughout also ancient foundations of Democritus and Epicurus of the atomism, but also to Spinoza, early modern works of Spinoza, of Rousseau, Marx, of Heidegger and Erdal, etc. And so materialism is, part of the point now, is distinct from Marxist view of materialism, which Althusser and a few others have critiqued as being fundamentally idealist, in the still wrapped up in notions of focus on human subject, on example necessity, and like its teleology as we discussed. What's rather, aleatory materialism is atomic, meaning it sort of views history as consisting of various constituent parts falling down like the rain, as sort of complex analogy goes. The materials are all connected together in a swerve or a new system called the encounter. We have let's give me a second, sorry. Because aleatory in the sense means random, things happen by a certain degree of chance. And it must mean things, it doesn't mean things happen just because, but there's always a certain degree of randomness in all historical outcomes. And it's all in turn randomness, it can be overturned. Same election can be lost, a pandemic can blossom, or suppose somebody dies. You can't predict these things, but nonetheless, they happen and sort of reduce things like nothingness, set up a new encounter and a new system, things goes forth. How to clear this down a bit more, very abstract explanations, a bit more coherent, I think it makes a good foundation for sort of reworked sort of materialism and aleatory sort of materialism in that sense. For one thing, I think what's interesting is that it enables us both to have radical breaks and continuity. Since these are the atoms, the radical components being people, classes, states, cultures, etc., had their own history and developed so dependent from each other in specific encounters. So you can trace specific encounters, be it period, epochs, construction things, and the component parts of each other, allowing us to have both in this very intricate system. So yeah, it's both comparing continuity and comparing breaks. So the recognition it opens up for is that a lot of the chance of all historical outcomes. We can also argue for great numerous casual explanations, they want to stick with one thing when it happens. But ultimately, you can't really determine which events are determines the most, and you end up sort of prescriptive situations where it's going to have to be this way. There's a real result for this, which also creates an awkward view of one's human agency, especially in case of various structure and theological views. While in a literary view, we recognize the set of change, the chance is a useful tool, enables us to. It's a chance having to solve itself, and it's always certainty and risk involved, and this sort of human agency can place itself in again as sort of unknown actor with some groups or individuals with sort of agency and power active in this. Also, crucial insight from some autonomous view of it is that states don't have to be so schematic and have to be successive in the sort of 5-6 modes they found. But since pick out a society is truly so universal as scholarship since Marx and its time have really elaborate upon, there can be quite a significant number of modes of production, distinctness and fluidness, intellectual context and time and place, and they can all lead different circumstances and factors into each other. Just because they end up in one mode of production across most of the world, it doesn't mean it started out in one mode of production most of the world. And this, of course, relates into solving the teleology of it. Because the essential insight that Althusser makes is that initial production is the same as the reproduction. I mean, the thing can sort of occur and establish itself, but there's a different way how it reproduces itself. And the production is very fragile and unstable, and it can itself end. So in the communism, when production is achieved one way or another, it doesn't mean that's the end, because it still reproduces in several directions, or it can fragile break apart. And in the end, there's really no end of history. You might want that to happen or not. Also, touch briefly on the base and superstructure. Althusser's comment on this is that the base overdetermines, meaning that in the last instance, it will influence more superstructure. Though Morris Marxist and Marx himself, no doubt, would recognize that superstructure also influenced the base in turn. Also, some comments are made on which you just abolish the whole distinction and just have different factors influencing each other. I am somewhat agnostic on this. I don't read listing. I think that's I'll leave that others to discuss than I can. So just briefly think about this at the end and conclude this and how, like in the literary history, relate to for political dimension of Marxism. Because abandoning tautology sort of means abandoning a certain certainty of victory and sort of comforting in defeat. It's eventually proven right and eventually sort of working class will triumph and social communism will triumph. And I think the insight made here is the one sort of Walter Benjamin makes in his thesis on history. And that is that historical materialism must always be right. It has to be actually, it must sort of prove the past verdict of history, or it must be made to pass the verdict of history. Meaning that if it doesn't work, we need to adjust it. And that hence it sort of is, it endures in that way anyway. And also I think a sort of political dimension and sort of inspiration that literary materialism does open up is that it's about to roll the dice. That in capitalism is not the end stage either, and it's fragile and it's based on its reproduction. That's very adaptable, very sustainable, sort of the proper term, but it can also just being done by a bad roll of the dice or a bad dropping of cards is not eternal either. It can't be undone. And finally, I want to take this on another of Benjamin's comments, and also Marx's idea of hope. Because history then is still, I think we should not abandon history as like a roadmap for hope for the future. They're very much intertwined. Benjamin called this the weak messianic potential of the past. And this, I think, is truly essential for Marxism, and abandoning for historical optimism and hope is means eternal abandoning Marxism as political party itself. And I think that's what everything I have to say today. Thank you.